have noticed that when we introduced imports and exports into our supply and demand model, we just took this world price as something that was given to us, rather than something that the domestic country could actually affect in one direction or the other. Here we just see that we took the world price as given, and in the context of imports, said that we were facing perfectly elastic supply of imports on the world market. And here again, when we were talking about exports, we took the world price as given and said that we were facing perfectly elastic demand for our exports. So it's actually worth thinking a little bit about where this assumption comes from, whether it's a reasonable one to make, and whether it actually affects the conclusions that we want to draw from these models. To understand what it means to take the world price as given, we need to understand where the world price comes from. Not surprisingly, the world price comes from supply and demand in the world market. So here you can see I've labeled this world market, and if we were to just think about all countries coming together and putting their stuff, the stuff they were producing and the stuff that they wanted to buy together, we would get some world supply that again is upward sloping in some fashion, as normal supply curves are. And we would get some world demand that's downward sloping, as demand curves generally are. And it's the intersection of these guys here that would actually determine the world price. Now we can think about why we would be able to take this world price as given, and we think about something called the small country assumption to do so. The small country assumption, not surprisingly, is the assumption that an individual country's supply and demand is very small or even negligible compared to the size of the overall supply and demand in the world market. And the reason that this is important and how it comes back to taking the world price as given is similar to that we see in the argument that we make for why firms can take the market price as given in competitive markets and why consumers can take the market price as given in competitive markets. So think about here. If we think about world supply, we consider a situation where, for whatever reason, our small country were to increase its supply by a lot. You'd say, well, from the perspective of that home country, that might seem like a really big deal, but on the scale of the world market, the increase in supply probably looks something, like this. That the overall world supply curve would barely move. So we can say, well, if we're only getting a marginal or almost negligible increase in supply, that's going to have a fairly negligible impact on the world price. So we can just approximate and say, let's just say that the effect of this one country's supply on the world price is basically zero. Similarly, we can think about what effect a change in demand by consumers in our small country would have on the overall world market. In that case, again, if our country were small, we might see a large change in demand on the scale of our domestic economy, but on the world market, again, that would probably seem like something that ended up being pretty small, and that we would get an almost negligible change in our overall world demand curve. And it might look something like this. Again, we can see how this sort of a change would have a small, at best, impact on the world price. So again, it seems okay under this assumption that this country is small compared to the overall world market, that this country doesn't really have the opportunity to impact the world price by changing its level of demand. Therefore, in order to find the world price that this small country takes as given, all we have to do is look at this intersection of world supply and world demand, see where that lands us in terms of price. We labeled that as P star sub W for world price here. And then we can just pull that over into our graph for our domestic market here. That we can say that this world price that prevails is exactly that price that our small country is taken as given. And that this horizontal line at this world price is what this small country is counting either as its supply of imports when it wants to be importing, or as its demand for exports when the country wants to be exporting. Notice that a small country in an economic sense doesn't necessarily have to be a small country in a geographic sense. It just means that the size of a market for a particular good or service in that country is small compared to the overall supply and demand of the world overall. You may find in some cases that we seem to apply this small country assumption in places where it doesn't really belong. For example, we talk a lot about the market for automobiles from the perspective of the United States, and we make this small country assumption that the US is a small country in the market for cars, when that's probably not technically the case. If the US were to change its individual supplier demand or its domestic supplier demand for vehicles, that is probably going to actually move the world price up or down, but we make this assumption nonetheless. And the reason that we do that is it makes the analysis of international trade a lot easier. And I know that that's not an excuse in and of itself, but what we find as economists is that making this assumption doesn't change any of the qualitative conclusions that we attempt to draw from our international trade models. So we get to the same place, we get to the same conclusions. We're not telling you anything different from what you would see if we took this assumption away. We're just making the math a lot easier, which seems like a good trade-off in that sense.